NATO Secretary General says there is one person able to kickstart peace talks on Ukraine.
As I said a number of times, there is only one person in the whole world who was able to break the deadlock when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and that is the American President Donald J. Trump, and he did.
Mark Rutte spoke after Tuesday's nearly 5-hour-long meeting at the Kremlin that failed to yield a breakthrough. It included Russian President Vladimir Putin, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and President Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now, nearly 4 years of war and Western sanctions appear to have taken a toll on Russia's economy. The IMF projects GDP growth will fall to 1.6% this year and reach 1% in 2026. And it also expects consumer inflation to climb this year to 9%. All of this while new U.S. sanctions on Russian oil and gas apply even more pressure. The head of Russia's second largest bank, BTB, told me yesterday that Russia's economy is doing quite well. And then I asked him how much longer it can endure sanctions. Listen.
I think quite long, because this kind of war that is requires probably less people, require less money, because it's kind of the new war. You don't have a thousand of tanks or thousand of aircraft fighting. It's some kind of, we call it a special military operation rather than war.
Elina Ribakova is the International Program Director at the Kyiv School of Economics, and she joins me now. I think you agree with Mr. Kostin on one thing. You do believe there's nothing economic that is going to bring Russia to the peace table, right?
Well, your question actually has two questions in it. I think even if the economic situation were much worse than what we're seeing now, I think Russia is much more focused on the geopolitical objectives than economic pain. And I think they demonstrated that decisively in 2022. That's one. And the second one, the current reduction in gross available resources, even though painful, is just not enough to push Russia towards negotiations.
So, Elina, the logical question then is what more can be done on sanctions? Now, look, President Emmanuel Macron believes that the new sanctions from Europe, that the new sanctions from the United States, especially on the two leading oil companies in Russia, that those will be, in his words, a game changer. Do you believe Europe and the United States have gone far enough to make this a game changer?
Well, I think sanctions can be an important tool in ending this war, but it's not a magic wand. The sanctions will not end the war. They will not make a regime change in Russia and many other wonderful things that people sometimes mistakenly expect from them. What sanctions can do is make it more difficult and more expensive for Russia to finance this war. I think VTB's Kostin just earlier was saying that, well, it doesn't cost much to finance the war. Well, newsflash, about 40% of Russia's federal budget revenues, almost half, goes to defense and security expenditure. Can you imagine that? That's a lot of money. So sanctions can try to shrink that amount of money. At the same time, China is a monopoly supplier for most parts, including from the West to Russia. And they have learned their lesson. They're charging extra for that supply, sometimes 2 or 3 times for the cost of the parts. So that's what sanctions can do. They can make it more difficult, but they're unlikely to end the war.
And then that brings me to the Russian people, who it's on their backs that this economy and war go on. Is there a tipping point there at all? And look, we know it is a repressive regime. There isn't a lot of pressure coming from any kind of protest from within Russia. But the president himself has to be concerned about what we see about, lineups for fuel. And if a lot of those costs start to hit basics, like things like food, do you believe that could eventually actually be a tipping point for Russia?
Well, Russia has been trying to redefine their contract with the population for the last 10 years. Basically, it used to be we give you a lot of money and you stay politically sort of uninterested in the current regime. Of course, since there's much less money, much more coercive tactics came forward. And I think the fact that, for example, you can no longer make calls on WhatsApp or other international media sort of channels, communication channels, right, is all a signal that President Putin's administration is trying to limit the news, trying to limit the ability for people to find the truth about what's happening, right? More coercive strategies. At the same time, we have seen contractual payments to go to fight in the war increase dramatically, and that gives some cushion. And also, finally, in many regions which have never seen any kind of social lift, they are now seeing some morbid social lift, whether if they work for the military enterprise or they're signing up for contracts to fight in Ukraine, and actually they're realizing some economic gains. So yes, on average, people are feeling the pain, but this is very uneven. And in some areas, some people are actually seeing the benefits of this war, economic benefits of the war.
And Elina, you make a good point, because for some people who've served in the military and survived, even when they go home injured, their lives are completely transformed by the kind of money that they've been paid by the Russian government. Elina Ribakova, really appreciate your insights. Thanks so much. Now,